Hello folks, the 5080 reviews are in and there's a lot to talk about. Let me switch to today's agenda. We're going to go through a roundup of the review benchmarks. We'll do a meta-analysis. We'll talk about the surprising lack of ray tracing uplift despite the additional RT teraflops that were advertised. We'll also look at how the review results compared to my predictions, and we'll discuss the surprisingly good overclocking potential of the 5080. We'll discuss who is the 5080 for, who's going to buy it and who's going to benefit from it, and then on into my final thoughts. So if you look at the VideoCardz.com roundup of all of the reviews, you'll see there's quite a lot of them there. Okay, there's quite a lot in different languages, so English, German, Spanish, Japanese, etc. And what I've done is I've gone through as many as I can find overall differentials for 1440p and 4K. Not all reviews do that. A lot of them just present the games, and it's up to yourself to go through and look at the games that interest you to see the uplift, to see what is a particular game that benefits or doesn't benefit from the new GPU. So all of the ones that did an overall uplift score or an uplift percentage did 4K, and many of them did 1440p as well. So there's about a dozen or so 4K results, and when you average them up they come to 13%. Now there's a bit of a wide range here. I know Optimum was quite disappointed with the 9% found there, so we're quite, I wouldn't say disparaging of the 5080, but certainly felt that they were expecting more basically. The highest one was Linus's 18%, and now there were individual results that were 20% plus, but there were also results that were underwhelming, and I'll come on to why I think that is. I think there's probably a good reason for that. When it comes to 1440p, quite a range. We're talking anything between 4% uplift and 12% uplift, and the average comes out to about 9%. Gamers Nexus didn't do an overall percentage, but the comment there was that commonly results that they found were within 7 to 12%. Now sometimes 20% at the upper range. A good review to look at if you're maybe trying to cherry pick which reviews will I look at, then there's too many there to go through them all. I recommend definitely looking at the Digital Foundry one. Now they do have, from a selection of games on a limited number of GPUs, they do show the difference between the 4080 Super, which is the comparison I've been looking at for that gen-on-gen uplift, and the 4090. Now, of course, Copbyte7Kimi, the famous poster on Twitter, had hinted at 5 to 10% uplift even over the 4090, and I think that got a lot of people's hopes up that they were going to get a 4090 for significantly less money. Despite the lack of VRAM, I think a lot of people were optimistic that truly high performance path traced 4K gaming was basically on the horizon. So not quite there, falls quite a way short, 20% short at 4K in fact. As regards the 4080 Super, similarly that sort of around the sort of 15% difference from in terms of uplift for the 5080 versus the 4080 Super, in that kind of ballpark. If you're looking for the bar charts, if you're looking for overall results, if you're looking at lots of different resolutions, lots of different settings, then the Tech Power Up one is actually quite good. Okay, you'll get your fill of bar charts, and these are all of the RT ones. So there's several games here running ray tracing. Okay, I'll come back to those, but you'll also find many other ones as well. Okay, so you can see here individual games for raster performance, performance per dollar, all kinds of results, as well as overall results. Okay, so you'll see what kind of gains you can expect in what games at the 3 main gaming resolutions. Okay, so for here we see 4K, the average FPS for the 5080 was 96.7 versus 85.5. Okay, so that's not a bad uplift. As I have it here, that's a 13%, so it's in line with the average. So if you're looking for something that's in line with the overall average, then it's probably worth going through all of the different charts and seeing if there's particular games that you're interested in and seeing what the uplift is for those. So that's the overall. Is it surprising? Is it in line with what was expected? I think a lot of people were expecting much better than this. To be honest, it actually slightly marginally exceeds what I expected, but I'll come on to that in a second. So I'm not saying it's a good uplift, I'm just saying it's slightly on the higher side of what I expected, okay, based on the specs, but we'll come on to that in a second. I want to talk about the surprising lack of ray tracing uplift. Now, when I looked at the specs listed by NVIDIA themselves showed quite a large uplift in ray tracing teraflops. So I was expecting, great things for path tracing, because path tracing is that kind of holy grail at 4K in particular. So the ultimate goal, I suppose, is that we get to a point where 4K native path tracing is realistic. No, it's not even realistic with a 5090. It's just still far off in the distance. We got some leaks in advance that the 5090 could only do path traced Cyberpunk at 4K native at about 30 frames per second. You do need upscaling, okay? And I'll explain why when you employ upscaling, you're not getting the uplift you'd expect. I'll come on to that in a second. So in terms of ray tracing, I want to show this German article here. So it's ComputerBase, and I've used Edge's translation to put it into English. And what they show is the uplift for full ray tracing. Okay, in other words, full ray tracing in Black Myth Wukong is the full path tracing. Now, they do have DLSS employed. Now, why is that important? Well, you'll be rendering internally at a lower resolution than 4K. And what that means is that you're not using the full capability of the GDDR7 memory. You're not maximizing the bandwidth. So if you're doing this natively at 4K with the full path tracing, now you're going to be getting ridiculously low frame rates in the teens or 20s. And yes, you'll get very significant uplifts then over a 4080 Super, because the 4080 Super struggles with bandwidth compared to the 5080. And then when you start upscaling, the bandwidth becomes less relevant. And so the uplift over the 4080 Super goes back to a more modest sort of 6, 7, 9, maybe 10% in a lot of cases. So that's quite disappointing, because if path tracing is your thing, then you're going to have to upscale, and you're not really getting the benefit out of that bandwidth that you would if you're going for full native 4K. Similar results here. So if I hover over 4K Cyberpunk DLSS quality with full ray tracing, so all the bells and whistles with path tracing, you're looking at a 7% uplift over the 4080 Super. Okay, again, this is because you're upscaling, I believe. I believe that's the main reason it's only this. If you were going native and you were going down, allowing the 4080 Super to go down into the teens, for example, and you have the 5080 in the 20s, you're going to see the 20% plus uplift, but you're not going to see it here with upscaling now, unfortunately. Even here, we're getting into the 30s, and realistically, that's not playable, is it? So it's kind of irrelevant. You have to go for performance mode, and I'm going to cover this towards the end. I'm going to show you what full path tracing with performance upscaling looks like on a 4080 Super, and then we can imagine what a few extra percent would get us, and see if that will make the difference and make it more playable. Okay, we'll come back to that towards the end. So there's a few games listed there. If path tracing is what you're looking for, if you're thinking the 5080 is what's going to take me over the edge and make 4K path tracing the most, beautiful experience you can have in video gaming, the 5080 isn't necessarily going to tip it over the edge and make that possible. Okay, so that's disappointing. I would love to find out more about why the uplift isn't there for ray tracing that was expected, because they did tout major improvements in ray tracing. So how do all these results compare to my predictions? So if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that my prediction based on things like core counts, clock speeds, the additional power, etc., was in the ballpark of 7 to 9%. If there's no ray tracing whatsoever employed, I was thinking 7% based on my calculations, and when there was a very light RT workload like RE4, or maybe the ray traced global illumination in the Indiana Jones game, then I was looking at maybe 9%. And when path tracing was employed, because of the extra RT cores, because you're at 4K, and because of the bandwidth, all these things, my estimation was 12 to 15%. So the overall average from the reviewers that I've seen is 9% at 1440p. So it's not too bad. It's in the same ballpark. I don't think there's that much CPU bottlenecking going on at 1440p, because the vast majority of these reviewers are using a 9800 X3D, and in most games, even at 4K, you're not going to hit bottlenecks. Maybe a game here or there, the multiplayer shooters, those kind of things, that might be the case, but I think the vast majority, and I've looked at individual results, and 9 or 10% tends to be typical when it's obvious that there's no CPU bottlenecking. So I think these are fairly consistent. The 13% at 4K, sometimes more, sometimes less, that is slightly better than I expected. And I think the reason for that is that I think, in large part, I think the 4080 Super was being held back by bandwidth more than I realized. It's obviously very hard to gauge, because, what have you got to compare it with? You've got basically nothing on the NVIDIA side that you could compare it in this class. And if you were looking at AMD and its bandwidth, you're not really comparing apples to apples. So it's very difficult to judge where bandwidth becomes an issue, with VRAM and so on. So it does appear that the 5080 is benefiting in some games that are bandwidth hungry. They tend to be benefiting a lot, and then you see your 18, 20% uplifts in those cases. But there are just as many games that are 6, 8, 10, 12% as well. So 13% I think is a realistic average, and reflects the way games are at the moment. Games may become more bandwidth hungry in the future as they allow games, more texture, to go more aggressive on texture pool sizes and things like that. Higher resolution textures. Maybe over time it will benefit more from the bandwidth, but at the moment 13%. So not too far away from where things were expected. Certainly not the 15, 20, even 30% we saw on some of the NVIDIA slides. When it comes to path tracing, again, surprising. The path tracing results are basically similar to the 4K results. So the 12 to 15% I expected was about right. So, however, there is that caveat. When you do employ the upscaling to make 4K path tracing playable, you're basically reducing the bandwidth requirement. So you're not getting the benefits from GDDR7 that you would if it was native. As it turns out, path tracing 4K native is just impossible, so you're not getting the benefit from the bandwidth. So in some cases, like Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong, according to these results here, you are looking around 6 or 7% sometimes, even with path tracing. And again, that I found that quite surprising. So, so the main takeaways: 1440p results show the limits of improvements to the node. There do seem to be some improvements, as I'll discuss in the next topic, but you know, it's only scaling slightly better than the core count. The core count is plus 5%, and what are we seeing? We're seeing 9% plus. And when you take bandwidth out of the equation, which I think the 1440p results mostly show, then you are seeing that 9% or thereabouts uplift, and that's fairly close to the core count scaling and the extra frequency and additional power to drive the extra cores and so on. The 4K native benefits are, you know, there's often a significant benefit from GDDR7. That almost 1 terabyte of memory bandwidth can lead to gains sometimes of 20%. So if you're gaming at 4K native and that's your thing, you're happy with 60 FPS at 4K native, everything maxed out, then you're going to be getting larger benefits in a lot of games. Not all games, but a lot of games that are bandwidth hungry will benefit from the GDDR7, and you'll see bigger uplifts than the 13% average. However, when upscaling is employed at 4K, you're not getting that benefit because you're not going to be memory bandwidth limited as much as you are when it's native. So there may be some times when you benefit, but not that many from the results that we've seen. The next topic is overclocking, and it's always interesting to see with a new architecture, is there something in it that allows for higher frequencies, the greater potential to, you know, get better results from while you're undervolting, all these kind of things. So a channel I like, a very straightforward, no BS type of a channel, who, now, he was surprised, I think, in the same way that I was surprised that there was actually a bit more uplift than anticipated by the raw numbers. So if you look at the frame chasers, and what he is seeing is that there is some improvement there in the node, and it goes beyond what the pure math would suggest. And he was able to overclock to between 3250 megahertz and 3300 megahertz, which is significantly more than the 3000 limit you'd typically find with Ada Lovelace. Okay, so the 4080 Super will allow you to go to about 3000 megahertz before you run into problems, and is capped at 350 watts when you do that. Obviously, it depends on the model of GPU that you get. Some of the cheaper ones may not allow you to go as far. The Blackwell architecture, however, allows to go significantly beyond 3000, according to this, and you're doing that with only an extra 25 watts, which is quite interesting. So he was suggesting that, you know, it's a 4 nanometer node, but it's 4 nanometer plus plus, that there's something going on that's beyond what was expected. So I think that's quite interesting. when he overclocked, he was getting an extra 8% in performance. And compared to the 4080 Super, with the synthetic benchmarks, like 3D Mark, for example, I think Time Spy was plus 18. No, I think, yeah, Time Spy was plus 18% maybe, and Firestrike plus 25%. It could be the other way around, but you were in that 18 to 25% performance uplift over the 4080 Super, which was also overclocked, which is quite significant. But again, these are synthetic benchmarks. They can benefit a lot from the bandwidth in a way that many games won't be benefiting from the bandwidth. So a lot of these synthetic benchmarks are best case scenarios and show the true potential of a card rather than typical performance. So games that leverage all of the extra power will do better than those that don't really use the memory bandwidth as much. Okay, so very much worth looking at. I will link to all of the referenced web pages and videos in the description. Okay, so we'll start to wrap up now. Who is the card for? If you're interested in that ultra smooth multi-frame generation experience, then based on what I've seen from videos like Hardware Unboxed and their analysis of MFG, you're going to need at least 70 frames a second to have what I believe is a playable latency, a playable input lag. And you need that high base frame rate as well to minimize artifacts, to keep the difference between two frames to the minimum. If you're going at 30 frames per second, then there's a lot more movement between each frame. So there's a lot more difference, and it's a lot more difficult to interpolate 3 frames in between. So you need to get to 70 plus, which means that something like 4K path tracing is going to be a huge challenge. If you want to do all of the eye candy, path trace lighting, etc., all the reflections, it's very difficult to get to 70 plus even on a 5080, even with DLSS performance, even with the lowest level of path tracing. So it's going to be a struggle. And you're going to need a 240 Hz monitor, in my opinion, for 3x. So inserting 2 frames in between each real one, or in between 2 real ones, to have a 3 times multiplier. If you're going to 70 plus FPS, you're going to need a 240 Hz monitor. There are some TVs, not that many, there's plenty of monitors available, 240 Hz 4K monitors, if 4K is your resolution. There's not so many available at 360 Hz, and definitely I'm not even aware of any TVs that are 380 or 360 Hz for your 4 times. So 70 or 80 frames per second multiplied by 4, you know, these things go in multiples of 120. So you're looking at 240, 360, 480, maybe 500 Hertz. So 360 is what you're looking at there. So again, you're shelling out over $1,000 probably for a GPU, and then you're expected to spend even more on your display. This card is on the edge of 4K path traced gaming, even with DLSS performance upscaling. So based on my analysis of the 4080 Super, the 4080 Super falls slightly short of what I would say is a playable 4K path traced experience. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a second. I will show you an example of a 4080 Super trying its best to maintain 60 frames per second in Cyberpunk with DLSS performance and the RT overdrive, and it's falling just short. It's agonizingly short. Maybe the 5080 will just tip it up to 60 frames per second, but it may not be able to maintain it. And then upscaling from there, you're introducing input latency, so it's on the edge. I think it shows that maybe you need at least a 4090 for that, but we'll have a look at that in a second. Anyone on a 30 series or less is going to benefit significantly. The 3090, 3090 Ti are borderline cases. It may not be worth the upgrade, especially when you're reducing the amount of VRAM you have. If you're looking for a high refresh 4K native gaming experience with no upscaling, then you are going to see the biggest uplifts from this card. Certainly in the 15 to 20% range in a lot of games. So if that's your thing, you don't like upscaling, you like that crisp 4K image, then you're going to get more benefit from this due to the increased bandwidth. And obviously I'm not going to go into AI and video editing and other productivity work, but the gains are more significant there than they are in gaming. So that's my overall summary. What I'll do now is let's talk a bit about this on the edge, or this high refresh 4K native experience. This is a 4K native DLAA experience. This is the absolute best experience you can have in Horizon Forbidden West. Everything is maxed out. Okay, it's very high. Everything is maxed out to the fullest on the graphics, and the display is 4K, and we have DLAA switched on, no DRS or upscaling or anything. This is the absolute maximum settings for this game, unless you're going to go to 8K or something like that. But you'll see here, it never drops below 60, and sometimes goes around 70. So there isn't any higher than this you can go, unless you're going super sampling or some other things that's non-standard. So you can see here, it's even in the 70s now. So it's a very, very good experience. So this type of experience is what the 5080 can give you, plus a few extra frames per second. If you went for quality level upscaling, you're going to get 100 plus with everything else maxed out. So that's what you're possibly going for. Anything below a 4080 Super isn't, or 4080 isn't going to give you that. Okay, so that is a significant upgrade, and it will benefit in a lot of cases from the extra bandwidth. Now, the other scenario, and this is Cyberpunk at 4K, and we can see here a couple of things. The frame rate, this is DLSS performance. This is very aggressive upscaling. It's as aggressive as we can go without a significant drop off in picture quality or image quality. Ultra performance would be a bridge too far. This is the transformer model. It's resolving text beautifully, reflections are lovely, etc., even despite the fact it's very aggressive upscaling. The latency is typically around the 40 milliseconds range, which in a single player game like this is, I think, very acceptable. Okay, but we're not quite at 60, we're in the 50s. Now, will a 5080 get you to 60? In this game, it's borderline. It might get you to 60, sometimes it will drop. But what you'd be looking at then is, of course, frame generation. So here we are with frame generation. Again, everything maxed out, RT overdrive, DLSS performance. This is the entry level to what you could say is the top level gaming experience. Okay, there really is nothing better than this. Now, obviously, I'd love to be able to upscale less aggressively, but now the input latency is in the 50s. Okay, again, it's still playable, but once you hit the 60s, I think you're at a point where it's starting to become unplayable. So I think once you hit 90 frames a second, I think it's, with frame generation, I think you're doing okay. I think it's very playable. There's not any particular artifacts that I notice here either, because you've got that base frame rate in the 50s, and you know, it's at the point where you're probably going to get away with artifacts. Okay, so it's well into the 90s there. So this is what you're looking at. You're looking at a 5080, hopefully getting you over 100 frames per second, 4K path traced experience with 2 times frame generation. You then have the option of 3 times to get you up to maybe 150 or so, and 4 times maybe gets you up to 200 or so. So that's what you're looking at. That's the type of experience potentially a 5080 can give you. What I would say is it's teetering on the edge of 4K path tracing. I think a 4090, I think that gets you there comfortably. It gives you a reasonable experience, and certainly a 5090 definitely gives you that kind of experience and allows you to experiment with less aggressive upscaling. The final one we'll look at here is a game called Desordre, which is a puzzle game a bit inspired by Portal. And here we've got the lowest level of path tracing. There's actually much higher path tracing than this. In fact, there's one setting that's named something like break your PC, okay, that it's so high. But this again, DLSS performance, the lowest level of path tracing, glossy surfaces. So we've got all the reflections, we've got the RT, global illumination, indirect lighting, all that kind of stuff. Again, very similar performance. This is typical in the 50s, okay? So turning on path tracing again gets you to, frame generation gets you to around that 90 frames per second. And again, similar latency figures that we saw before, 50s for frame generation, 40s for without frame generation. So the point I'm making there is it's just on the edge of that supreme experience that NVIDIA is marketing, okay? What they're marketing is that it's native doing 20 or 30 frames per second on the 5090, and then you upscale with performance DLSS, and then you use MFG to go up to 200 plus FPS. And what I'm showing there is that unless you're at least in the 50s, that latency is just going to cripple you, and I don't think it's playable. So look, I think I've gone on too long. I think that should give you a good overview of where we are with the 5080 and who that 5080 is for. Is it for you? I'm going to get one if I can, hopefully on launch day. If not, then I'll just have to wait like everyone else, but I'll see if I can get one. I'll be there at 2 p.m. our time, refreshing the page, seeing if I can put one into my basket and buy it, so that I can go ahead and do some comparisons with the 4080 Super, test out all the features, look at all the tech demos, and bring you the full experience of what's possible with a 5080 and whether all that new tech that they're talking about it benefits us, and how far away some of the things like neural rendering is, okay? But for now, I think I've gone on for far too long, and I'll see you in the next video.